Hello everybody, and welcome to Eagle Point Funding's webinar. Today's webinar topic is government funding for cybersecurity. We'll be discussing lots of interesting and useful information, and we'll give you some examples of funding opportunities. I'm Anat Landa, Director of Business Development at Eagle Point Funding, and I'm delighted to be presenting today's webinar. To learn more about Eagle Point Funding, you can visit our website, eaglepointfunding.com. To keep up to date on the latest in R&D government funding, you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as join our LinkedIn group. Our webinars are recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel called Eagle Point Funding. In addition, I'll be sending out the slide deck to all of you who registered for today's webinar. Feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. At the end of this webinar, I hope we'll have some time for Q&A, and you can enter your questions in the question window on the side of your screen. You are also welcome to call me or email me directly with questions which are specific to your situation or science. My contact information is on the last slide of today's presentation. Now, before we begin, I'll give you a brief overview of the company. Eagle Point Funding is a consulting firm. In fact, we're the leading company specializing in the attainment of government grants and contracts for companies and research centers. Our main objective is to help our clients get as much funding as possible from government sources. We have extensive experience guiding companies that seek funding from nearly all non-dilutive sources out there. In the US, the main agencies are the DOD, NSF, DHS. In the EU, they are most notably Horizon 2020, Eureka, and Eurostars. Our fields of expertise are cybersecurity, big data, fintech, energy, aerospace, and ICT. We'll talk about some of these opportunities in this webinar. Let's begin with a cartoon. Now, it certainly took time for both the private sector and the government to really understand cybersecurity and the major risks of cyber attacks. Today, and I think all of you here can definitely agree with me, this is a major concern. And my purpose today is to help you find funding for your efforts to address this concern. Here is an interesting chart that shows where spending is being directed for security. You can see that the blue bars indicate the items purchased in 2015, and the green bars are planned purchases for 2016. You can see that in many areas there is a great deal of spending for security. As you'll see soon, government funding covers almost all of these areas. Now, there are diverse sources of funding out there to support your R&D activity, such as VCs, angels, bank loans. Today, I'm going to focus on non-dilutive funding, mainly from government sources. Government funding is a unique source of funding you can't afford to ignore. The main benefits are that this is a risk-sharing model. There are no royalties, there is no equity taken, and there is no interference in company decision-making. The government does not become part of the company's board. Again, this is a grant and not a loan. You don't have to return the funds. Also, receiving government funding is a seal of approval for the company and will attract private investments in other contracts with the government for procurement of the product supported. Eagle Point Funding is basically your key to expanding your R&D funding. When we start working with a client, the first thing we do is to identify the most relevant funding opportunities out there. This is a very important step. If you have great science but apply for a grant that's not relevant to your science or use the incorrect mechanism, you will not be successful, despite the fact that your R&D really deserves the funding. Our analysts lead the identification process. They create a list of opportunities and together with you, we create a multi-submission grant strategy in order to expand your R&D funding potential. We also manage complex submission processes and work closely with you to prepare the application. We cannot do this alone. We need you on board in this joint effort, since you are the experts in your science, of course. And of course, when relevant, we guide through the final contract negotiations. In this webinar, we'll discuss cybersecurity funding opportunities, as well as government guidelines and regulations. I'll also give examples of specific solicitations and offer some keys to maximize your chances for an award. Where is the money? This is a list of all the departments in charge of the funding. So here we have the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, Department of Defense, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, DTRA, Air Force, etc., Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, Department of Energy, DHHS, and within it is the National Institutes of Health, Department of Commerce. And you can certainly learn from this that there are many funding departments and agencies that you may not have even thought about that can be relevant for you to win a grant or contract and support your R&D activity. For example, the Department of Energy has a budget for cybersecurity for infrastructure, and the Department of Commerce funds security research for banks. The NITRD is the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program. It's a government program that coordinates all requests for cybersecurity across all agencies. This table shows budget requests by agency for 2016. Now the total budget, the total funding here is $4.1 billion. These are budget requests by program component area, or as we call them, PCAs. Cybersecurity is a major area of funding. This PCA receives 18% of the budget. However, keep in mind that there is also funding for cybersecurity activities in other areas as well. Here you can see the trends in the budget since the year 2000. You can see that the NITRD budget has increased tremendously from only $1.5 billion in 2000 to $4 billion in 2015. As I mentioned earlier, the 2016 budget request stands at $4.1 billion. And just last month, President Obama's budget proposal for 2017 is $19 billion specifically for cybersecurity. Now let's look at some of the funding opportunities. There are two general types of solicitations. Solicited applications address a specific area of interest. And we also have BAAs, which are broad agency announcements, or unsolicited. And here, investigator-initiated is required. For BAAs, you should try to establish an interest prior to submission. Let's begin with the two most relevant programs for small businesses, the SBIR and STTR. These are dedicated specifically for small companies. While SBIRs and STTRs have some similar goals, their objectives differ. SBIRs are intended to increase private sector commercializations for innovations. STTRs are intended to stimulate a partnership of ideas and technologies between innovative SBCs, small business concerns, and nonprofit research institutions. It's interesting to note that there are funds set aside for small businesses within each funding department. In order to be eligible for an SBIR or STTR, the entity applying for the grant must be a for-profit company, and it must have its place of business in the US. It must also be at least 51% US owned and controlled by one or more individuals who are citizens of or permanent resident aliens in the US, or at least 51% owned and controlled by another for-profit business that is at least 51% owned and controlled by one or more individuals who are citizens or permanent residents aliens in the US. As well as that, it also can't have more than 500 employees, including affiliates. Also, VC ownership is not a problem as long as they are US VCs and there's more than one VC owner. If the company is backed by only one VC, that can be a problem. Very important to note, all of these eligibility requirements must be met at the time of the award. This means, for example, if you have 450 employees, but by the time the award is granted, you have 500 employees, that will be an issue. Now, don't worry if you don't get it all. You can always contact me to get that information again, because this is definitely a lot of stuff. SBIRs and STTRs are great mechanisms, and they're considered by many as a gateway to larger awards. But of course, there are many more funding opportunities out there. BAAs, large-scale applications, contracts, and cooperative agreements. You should keep in mind other funding opportunities outside the US. For example, not many Americans are aware that they can also receive funding from NATO. Now, in order to increase your chances of success, we suggest a multi-submission strategy, submitting no less than 3 to 6 proposals each year. Now let's discuss specific opportunities available today. Here is a great opportunity in the Department of Defense. According to Cybersecurity Framework, this opportunity is relevant to identification, protection, detection, and response. This funding may take the form of a grant, cooperative agreement, or contract. The duration of this project is up to 3 years per project. You are not committed to the entire 3 years period. It depends on negotiations and the type of projects you have. Now, who is eligible? Both US and non-US entities. This solicitation by DARPA is published as a BAA, a broad agency announcement. This is a technique for United States government agencies to support basic and applied research in certain developments. This topic funds identification and detection. DARPA Cybersecurity Framework supports empowerment of the human within the information ecosystem and the guarantee of trustworthy computing and information. This funding may take the form of a grant, cooperative agreement, or contract. And again, eligibility is relevant both to US and non-US entities. This solicitation by DOE is dedicated to identification, protection, detection, and response. The DOE Cybersecurity Framework supports tools and technologies to enhance and accelerate deployment for cybersecurity capabilities for US energy infrastructure, including cybersecure integration of smart grid technologies. This funding takes the form of a grant. The budget is up to $4 million per grant. The duration is up to 3 years support. And who is eligible? Both US and non-US entities. And here's an example of a solicitation in NATO, which is Science for Peace and Security, SPS. The topics funded are critical infrastructure, protection, including sharing of best practices, capacity building, and policies. This grant supports development of cyber defense capabilities, including new technologies, and support for the construction of information technology infrastructure and cyber defense situation awareness. This funding takes the form of a grant. The duration is 2 to 3 years of support per project. The typical project lasts up to 3 years. So these are some examples of great funding opportunities available today. There are many more out there, and I'll be happy to specify the funding opportunities relevant to each of you. Now, from a broad perspective, I'd like to take a step back and give you an idea of how our approach to government funding and how to maximize your chances for an award. First of all, you need to know the interests of the funding agency. What's on their agenda? What are they interested in funding? What will not get funded because it's not within their scope or is no longer within their scope? And if necessary, you need to communicate with the agency program officers. This is a crucial step to matching your project with the right funding mechanism. You need to focus your project application. Focused applications have a higher chance of being favorably reviewed. Remember, the funding does not cover companies or lab expenses. It covers projects. You don't want your proposal to come across to reviewers as overly ambitious or unrealistic. Make sure to ask for what is necessary. Don't inflate the budget or ask too little. Having an accurate budget shows that you are realistic about your project and its funding needs. Make sure to present a complete project. Have one comprehensive storyline, and be sure to leverage your research collaboration. It's important to collaborate even if the funding mechanism does not require it. Take on consultants or outsource work you're less proficient at or don't have the expertise to complete. To maximize your chances of winning an award, and the largest award possible, I can't overstate the importance of targeting the right mechanism. As you saw in the solicitations I mentioned earlier, there are many programs and many different funding mechanisms. It's very important to know your way around these mechanisms, as they represent more than just letters and numbers. They represent the requirements of the solicitation, the nature of the project, the budgetary consideration, etc. There are many different pockets of money, and you really need to know how to target the right one for your project. It's vital to understand the different award sizes and success rates. Know the different funding levels and match them to your requirements and needs. And of course, conduct a comprehensive strategic assessment. What are your objectives? What research are you doing, and what stage are you in? Where would you like your research to be in the next 12 to 24 months? And what is the potential for success for each research project? And all of this should be done with the goal of creating a multi-submission strategy. The more shots at the goal, the better your chances for success. To summarize what Eagle Point Funding does, we offer 2 core services. First, we conduct a strategic assessment. Our analysts begin by understanding your specific science, where you are now and where you would like to be in the next 12 to 24 months. Then, based on a series of conference calls as well as information you supply us with, we provide a list of opportunities which is used by creating the multi-submission strategy. Now remember, specific solicitations typically account for only around 30% of awards. The remaining 70% are unsolicited or investigator-initiated. In order to properly file for one of these unsolicited awards, our analysts engage program officers to get their feedback. A lot can be learned about how to best focus the application by speaking with the program officers. And this also improves your chances for success, of course. Strategic assessment is an ongoing process. Funding opportunities present themselves literally every day, and when an opportunity emerges that meets your requirements, we'll present it to you and see how to best incorporate it to your strategic plan. Once we have this multi-submission strategy in place, the grant consultant joins the picture, and he manages the grant writing process. This is a joint effort. We can't do it without you. We manage the process, creating comprehensive templates based on solicitation guidelines, and fill in as much information as we can. But it's your science, and you know it best. This ongoing back and forth process with you answering questions, filling in missing information, and us communicating the information, writing and sometimes rewriting parts, organizing budgets, etc., is what goes into submitting the highest quality application with best chances of success. Another way to look at it is to make non-dilutive funding a strategic source of funding for your company, maximizing your company's funding potential. Well, that's it for now. Thank you for joining us today to learn about government funding opportunities for cybersecurity, grants, and contracts. I hope you found it interesting and useful. I want to also thank our senior analyst, Alon Nardi, who helped me prepare for this presentation. To learn more about Eagle Point Funding, you can visit our website, eaglepointfunding.com. To keep up to date on the latest in R&D government funding, you can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, as well as join our LinkedIn group. If you have any questions on this subject, I am happy to answer them now, as much as time allows. If you have questions about your specific project or science, I'd be happy to answer them as well. However, I do think that it would be better to answer them one-on-one, so please email me with your questions or let's arrange for a time to speak. Let's see if there's any questions written here. Okay, so I do have a question here on the eligibility of virtual companies. Actually, virtual companies were not eligible until recently, up till mid-2013, but now most are eligible. I'll be happy to discuss this with you and anyone else who is interested, so let's set up a time to speak about it. I think it would be a better way to deal with it. And now I also have a question regarding our costs. So we work primarily on a success-oriented basis, which is usually 5% of the amount of the grant awarded. We also charge a monthly retainer for our services. Again, this is something we can speak about more in depth one-on-one. Okay, so I think that's all, and I apologize if I didn't get to your question. But please feel free to contact me directly. I look forward to being in touch with you. And again, I'll be sending all the people who registered for today's webinar the slide deck and a recording of this webinar. So thanks again for attending and have a great day.